Am I right in my assumption? Yes, no,
Yeah.
Brown v. Board. Okay. All right. So when we look at Brown v. Board, for this particular class, we talked about that this landmark decision. You know, we know of Brown v. Board, but we often forget that there was another case, Brown 2, that comes right afterwards. And the reason why we needed Brown 2 was what?
To enforce it.
We needed a sequel to the movie.
Then why did we need the sequel?
To enforce it.
Because why? Yeah, but why do we need that enforcement of that?
Because otherwise, because I've got a phone friend.
Okay, phone a friend.
The first one was just for that one little girl, and so I'm like, but from then on, if any other kid wanted to go to a school that they were going to, they would have to sue also. And so the second round was to actually make it some sort of enforcement. Not like an enforcement, but to like reinforce
Kind
it.
of, but
Phone a friend. Well, I'm phoning you.
The first one didn't have like a time limit, so you could just, push it off, but the second one's like as soon as possible.
not actually as soon as possible. It says
ASAP.
No.
ASAP.
with all deliberate speed, right? With all deliberate speed. Okay, so what the heck does with all deliberate speed mean? Yeah, I don't know what that means either, right? Some are going to take their time. Some are going to move towards that a lot quicker. But the reality of it is there's no actual timeline. With all deliberate speed could mean anything and everything. And so as a result of that, we see then on our timeline kind of civil rights here, that they are forced to address how are we actually going to enforce this. And even after we have Brown 2, is it immediately, do we see an end to segregation in the schools?
No.
No, and actually it takes another Supreme Court decision in 1959 to actually force the schools to integrate. So,
That's what Warriors Don't Cry is about.
it is, yes. Well, it's about the precursor to that 1959 decision, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the other one where it was about the guy?
I remember that story. And also that book that you read, the one that you read in high school, in the structure of Davies High School, it's actually a shortened version of the actual book.
Yeah, it's just a memoir.
So,
It's an excerpt from the memoir.
Yeah, it's mostly there, but there's spots of it that are missing. Some of the more graphic parts are actually missing from the version that you read.
Which is a shame because it doesn't drive home the point fully then.
I agree. And I also think, you know what, that's life.
Yeah.
Didn't we have to skip that part in the movie when we watched the
Yeah.
I never watched the movie.
That's ridiculous also.
There was a movie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, when we read the Tigers one,
Yeah.
what's that?
Tears of a
Tears
Tiger,
of a
and
Tiger.
he commits suicide and that's okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So what we have then as with Brown v. Board is the beginnings of kind of that push towards greater civil rights. Now most people would argue that really the civil rights movement begins when Rosa Parks refuses to give up her bus seat. But I would actually argue it begins with this young man. And now this is Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was a young man from Chicago, and he goes down south to visit some cousins that he has down in Mississippi. Now, being a young man from Chicago, Emmett Till doesn't understand racial, moral code, ethical code, racial laws, some actually written, some not written. He just doesn't understand it, and he's a 14-year-old boy, right? So how much of it he would have actually understood, we don't really know. But he definitely, because he didn't grow up in the South, he didn't understand his position in society in the South. Now, he happens to go into a store, and supposedly on his way exiting the store, he sees a young white woman, and he decides to whistle at her. Now, is it possible for a 14-year-old boy to see a woman, white or otherwise, and find her attractive and decide, I'm going to whistle at her?
I feel like that is very possible.
Yeah, that's very possible, right? He's a 14-year-old boy. So it's very possible that he's like, I think she's pretty cute. I'm going to let and I think she's attractive, right? But in the social structure, the cultural structure of Mississippi, him being a black male and whistling at a white female is a big no. Yeah, a big no. So much so that ultimately it will lead two men, J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant, to actually kidnap him, beat him, torture him, and then ultimately lynch him, and then take his body, weigh it down, and throw it in the Tallahatchie River. Alright? Now, we don't know whether he actually whistled at them or not, and we won't ever actually know because Emmett died, right? And so it doesn't really work for that. But here we have a young boy who dies solely because he stepped outside of the bounds of his role in society in the South based on his race. Now it goes to trial. And the two men that actually participated in the act that we know of at that time, they aren't really quiet about the fact that they did it. Okay? Now they don't say it out in court that, yeah, we did it, yeah. But in society, in the town, they go around and they talk about having committed this crime. They make no bones about the fact that they did this. But they go to trial. And an all-white jury of their peers finds them innocent. They're acquitted on all charges. Now, the story could have ended there, but Emmett's mother, Mamie, when she goes for her son's funeral, she refuses to allow a closed casket funeral. Now, they discover the body in the Tallahatchie River, mostly because the ropes that were used to tie him to the weights to bring him down, they get caught up in, what are they called, like a water mill, for a flour. They get caught up in one of those, and it brings his body to the surface. So they find his body. They found, of course, a body that was not only brutally beaten, but it's a body that is beginning to decompose. And so the body itself was swollen in part because of it being in the river, but also in part because it was starting to deteriorate. But you can see from the image that he was very badly beaten before he was finally hung. Lynched.
I think that's you.
That is his face. There's his ear, his mouth, his nose. This is where his eye sockets would be if they weren't so puffed up. Now, the funeral directors, they try to convince Mamie to at least cover his face, right? To not have it so that it's visible. And she says no. Those men, using a few different words, but those men need to see what they did to my son. The world needs to see what they did to my son. The funeral directors go as far as to actually lay a handkerchief over the top of his face, but when she arrives for the viewing, she removes it. The press is called in to document his services. Now here's the thing. It's 1955, right? And we have to think about the context of 1955. What are we in the midst of in 1955?
The Cold War.
The Cold War, right? And here we are in the Cold War, and this is being broadcast on all of our newspapers. How are we fulfilling a democracy when yet we are not allowing some people in our society to be fulfilled within that democracy? On top of that, it's a kid. It's a 14-year-old boy. 14-year-old boys make mistakes. 14-year-old girls make mistakes too, but 14-year-olds, right? your temporal lobe is not fully developed. So sometimes you do some pretty stupid things. Okay? Unfortunately, this thing happened to lead to his death because of the racial structure of that community. Now, we get additional evidence in 2004 that basically says there were actually more people that were involved in the crime than just those two men. And so there's a call to actually have them brought up on prosecution, but they're not. Now, there are some cases that have been prosecuted in the South that since, again, a more modern time, but it's pretty rare. Because if you think about it, 2004, this happens in 1955. So let's say you're 30 in 1955. 2004, you're now, yeah, okay, almost 80 years old, right? So it doesn't take long before the key players in here are no longer even alive. So you don't have the ability to prosecute them. Now, 3 days after the Emmett Till's body is discovered in the Tallahassee River, 3 days after, a young woman, or not a young woman, a woman, she's 42, but in the name of Rosa Parks, refuses to give up her seat on a bus. Now here's the deal. Rosa Parks, as much as we talked about Linda Brown as being like the perfect candidate to push us into Brown v. Board, so is Rosa Parks. She is not the first person to give up or to refuse to give up her seat on a bus. Okay? There were others. In fact, there was a girl in March of '55. She was 15 years old, Claudette Colvin, who refused to give her seat up to a white man. But there's a problem with this 15-year-old girl. Well, she is poor. She's young. She's a 15-year-old, right? She's also pregnant. She's a 15-year-old, unwed, pregnant girl. She is not the poster candidate for, hey, let's all boycott the buses and get everybody on board with this, right?
Yeah.
Rosa Parks, on the other hand, is a secretary in the NAACP. She's a seamstress. She's a member of the middle class. She's always done everything right in her life. She's never been in trouble for anything. She is a prominent member of her church community as well. So let's see. 15-year-old pregnant girl or secretary of the NAACP. Which one is the black community going to rally behind, and not just the black community rally behind, but the white supporters are going to see a greater desire for support up. Now, if you ask me, having had 2 children, I'm sorry, Rosa Parks, but I think you probably could have not given up your bus seat. As a pregnant woman, there are days when you just need to sit down. Okay?
Yeah.
Just letting you know, okay? Yeah. But anyways, Rosa Parks becomes the poster child then of the bus boycott. And in Montgomery then, we wind up seeing a strike of the buses that lasts for 400 days. So just over a year. Now she is fined $10 for refusing to give up her seat. In addition to that, she has to pay $15 in court fees. Now here's the deal. Rosa Parks is a member of the NAACP, right? I said she's the secretary of the NAACP. So that day, when she got on the bus, guess what? She knew she wasn't going to give up her seat if asked. We can't rally behind Claudette, but we can rally behind Rosa. This is something that the NAACP wanted to happen. So they ensured and made sure somebody was on that bus who was going to be able to, we were going to support behind. So yes, mind blown, it's staged. Okay?
Just like the moon.
Yeah, okay? Not that the other people on the bus knew that it was going to happen, but that she and the NAACP knew that she was going to do this, and they knew that they were going to launch into a bus boycott as a result of her refusing to give up her seat. Now, over the course of those 400 days then, the amount of money that the city of Montgomery loses is dramatic. Because 88%, almost 88%, of the city's bus users were black, or African American. Why? Because they couldn't afford to buy cars, because they were largely working in very low skill, low pay jobs. So they rode the bus to get to work. On top of that, their work sites were often much farther away from where they lived, because they often had to live in much more segregated communities. So they needed those buses. Well, now you have 88% of the population of Montgomery that's not riding the city's buses. For 400 days, right? So over a year. And no big. Why?
Well, because they're not getting enough money to make busing viable as a thing.
That's a huge blow to your economy. And do you still have to run those bus routes whether there's people on the bus or not? Mm-hmm. Yep. So you're paying out and spending out money without having anybody actually on those buses. Now, they could have boycotted the buses, and it could have only lasted a couple of days because, right, people need to get to work. But it's 400 days. So logistically, they have to figure out how to organize to ensure that the bus boycott goes on. And the way we do that is through the use of the black churches, which, if you've ever been to the South, I don't know if anybody's ever been to, like, the South, but if you ever go to, like, a Southern Baptist church, like a black Southern Baptist church, you'll understand the role that the church plays in the African American community. Okay? It's pretty impressive, actually. Now, that being said, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who is already a member of the NAACP when Rosa refuses to give up her seat, he begins to push and help organize this bus boycott through the use of the churches. People would meet at church. There were the few people who had cars would come. They would carpool people. They would walk in large groups together to get to work so that there was safety in numbers. And it was largely effective. So at the end of that 400 days then, Montgomery is forced to integrate their bus system. And as a result, we'll see Alabama integrate their bus systems, other states beginning to integrate their bus systems. It is through this then that Martin Luther King Jr. will rise to prominence within the organization. He begins calling for an end to Jim Crow. That we need to push for integration, increase voting rights. But he argues that unlike maybe some other elements of change or trying to create change, the best way for the African American community to create that change is to make sure that they're being peaceful. Because if they're not, then it's basically like a self-fulfilling prophecy to the whites. See, I told you black people were violent. That's why we can't share things with the black people, because they're violent people. So rather than reaching out in violence, let's work together. Now, during that bus boycott, King's home is bombed. In addition to that, there are several churches that are bombed. including one in which 3 young girls, when they are in the process of getting ready to go to school or to Bible school in the morning, are in the church early and they die in the church. Okay? The guy that committed that bombing, he's never even brought to trial until the 1970s, when a man will become I can't remember if he just becomes a judge or he becomes a governor, and he pushes for the prosecution of the dude because when he was a child he read about it and he thought that the guy should have been prosecuted and he wasn't. And the guy and the Ku Klux Klan actually write a letter to the governor, basically like threatening him, and he writes back, "Kiss my," fill in the
There you
blank.
go.
Okay? And that's all he says. Okay, and it goes from there. Okay. Now, King then, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, will then, in 1957, will create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Again, working through the African American community churches. He believes it will help them to organize the civil rights movement. He also calls for the majority of that organization to come from the youth. He says that while it's important for our older members of our community to be active and be involved, they have much more to risk than the younger members of our community. They have families to support, so they have to keep their jobs. Whereas the young members of our community don't have that same scenario. And they can be much more vocal and much more active than somebody with a family to support, or somebody that if they died, it would be a real big hardship for the family. So he pushes within this for that civil disobedience and to be pushed from the youth culture. Now this works perfectly if you're thinking about the 1950s youth culture, because the youth of the 1950s are already pretty well disillusioned with the culture of their parents, which is typical of all youth culture, right? We're going to do things our way. We don't do things the way our parents did. Our parents, they're such idiots. They don't know anything. That youth culture occurs all the time, right? It might change a little bit. Think of the Flappers. Are the Flappers youth culture? Pushing back against the established traditions? Yeah, the Beats, that's that youth culture. The counterculture movement of the 70s. The grunge movement of the 90s. Okay? Same concept, it's just different time frame, right? Same kind of idea of the youth pushing back. So it works. He argues that they had the moral, religious, and ethical obligation to create redemption and reconciliation amongst the races. Now it is in that realm then that the NAACP will begin seeking 9 young students to integrate a school to force for Brown v. Board and Brown 2 to actually be effectively utilized and implemented. To test that with all deliberate speed, right? Now, it is within that context then that numerous children will actually apply to be one of the Little Rock 9. But ultimately they will select Senior Ernest Green, Junior Elizabeth Eckford. That's Elizabeth right there, by the way. Okay. Probably one of the most famous images of, and I think it's just because it pops up really quickly when you Google, right? Civil rights or racism, it pops up really quickly. But a very iconic image. The woman behind her actually has since apologized to her about that, but the photographer just happened to be there at the right time to catch it. But it's very typical of their experience trying to get to school. So you had Junior Elizabeth Eckford, Terrence Roberts, Minnie Jane Brown, Thelma Mothershed and Melba Patillo, who's Melba Patillo Beals now, which you're familiar with because of Warriors Don't Cry, were also juniors. Jefferson Thomas was a sophomore. Yes, Jefferson Thomas, not Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson Thomas. Okay? And Gloria Bray was also a sophomore. And there was only one freshman. Okay? Carlotta Walls. Those 9 then, with the help of the NAACP, were to begin school in the fall of 1958 at Little Rock Central High. But unfortunately for them, the governor, Orville Faubus, says of them integrating the school that he will not allow it. He says segregation today,
Segregation tomorrow.
segregation forever.
Wait, that's him?
Yeah.
Segregation tomorrow.
Segregation today, segregation forever. And he is very much, I am not going to allow this to happen. And so as a result, he calls out the National Guard. Now he can do that because he's basically the commander-in-chief of the National Guard. The National Guard is your state-run militia. So he can call out the National Guard, and the National Guard is basically for his disposal. But he is actively blocking a Supreme Court decision to integrate public schools. So you have a Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who has decided this is going to happen. Not once, but twice now, okay? Because Brown v. Board and Brown too. And it's still 1958. So what is still going on in the world? The Cold War, right? So our president, Eisenhower, has a decision to make. Do I allow Faubus to prevent the integration of Little Rock High? Which I could totally do. Okay, as long as it says me. Which I could totally do. Or do I prevent him from doing this? Now, if you're Eisenhower, you really only have one choice. You have to step in and prevent him from being able to block that integration. Because otherwise, everything that you are telling people in the world about a democracy, and that a democracy is better than a communist government. Because in a democracy, you have a voice and a say in your government, and you are equally represented within your governmental system. If you allow Faubus to prevent these 9 children from integrating Little Rock Central High, you are denying the 14th Amendment rights of due process to those children, and ultimately to all children, because it would effectively reverse Brown v. Board, right? Because it's not enforceable. Wouldn't really work well on the world stage, right? So rather than turn a blind eye, and he realizes that he is in defiance of the supreme law of the land, right? He's in defiance of the Constitution of the United States. And he is basically, this racial issue at home is not boding well on a national stage. So he sends in the 101st Airborne Division. It's not like he's just like, okay, you Army group, go in there. He sends in the 101st. One of the most decorated units in our military structure. So, again, that's saying a lot. He could have sent in anybody, right? Joe Schmo, whoever, but he doesn't. He sends in the 101st Airborne to personally walk and protect and make sure these students were able to integrate Little Rock Central High School. Now, Faubus, not to be, pushed around by Eisenhower, at the end of that school year, he shuts down the public schools in the state.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
You can't force me to integrate public schools if we have no public schools. Okay, I wouldn't. And technically he's right. They then sent the white students to private schools. The governor backed those private schools with funds from the state so that students who couldn't afford tuition at those private schools could go to school in those private schools, and effectively prevented all African American students in the state from attending school. Now here's the problem with that now. He's not just denying the rights and the access, the access to, well, Brenna's not actually here, but Claire might be able to answer for it, it's her sister. I don't know if she's not here or what.
She's sick at home. Oh, so she was only marked absent once then. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't know if your mom called in, my mom and dad were like arguing like who's.
Oh, okay. Yeah. She's squared away. Sue will take care of her. Okay, so here's what you need to understand with this though, right? He shuts down and he effectively prevents all African American students from attending school. Now, again, Eisenhower could just let that go, but, right, world stage, Cold War, okay, have to do something here. And you also have to know Eisenhower as an individual was somebody who does seek to integrate and push for more racial integration. In fact, it's under Eisenhower's administration that we see the desegregation of the armed forces. So it's not like it's out of his wheelhouse of things. But I can guarantee you that Eisenhower is also largely influenced by the fact that the Cold War is going on. So in '59, the Supreme Court will rule yet again that preventing African American students from attending, or for that matter, any student from attending a school that they desire to attend based on race is unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment. Thowis, open your schools. So in August of '59, Thowis is forced to open up the public schools again. Now we have integration, forced integration. Does that make sense? Okay? And the schools only closed a year. In the meantime, that Little Rock Nine, though, they will move, largely because of the hostility that the families face. They will move to other areas. Most of them will move to Chicago. As a result, the only African American student of the Little Rock Nine that actually graduates from Central High is Ernest Green, the senior. Everyone else graduates from different schools. So, but they push it through. Okay? Now, here's the other thing. You have to understand that at the same time some of this is going on, Eisenhower is working to change some civil rights laws, okay? And Congress is working to change some of those civil rights laws. So it's not even, as much as it is about the Cold War and a violation of the Brown v. Board decision, it's also a violation of other laws that are coming out, all right? And that Eisenhower and Congress are implementing. Those civil rights laws become the first civil rights legislation in 80 years. But the ideas in these is it would expedite some of those court cases that are coming to the Supreme Court and help to cause more change. It also would allow them greater jurisdiction over violations of the 14th and 15th Amendment and allow them to prevent those continued violations. So we see the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which creates the Civil Rights Commission. We're going to investigate and report on what's going on. We're going to give Eisenhower all the information that he needs, and Congress all the information they need, in order to best be able to deal with this, solve this, come up with a solution. It additionally gives the Attorney General the power to require federal courts to issue an injunction, which basically would allow him to say, okay, Falbus, you're not doing your job. We're going to put you in jail if you don't start doing your job and listening and obeying to the supreme law of the land. Does that make sense? Okay? But it allowed them to do that much quicker versus, okay, well, let's go to the citizens of the state and try to get the citizens of the state to impeach you or to recall you or whatever.
Yeah.
It allows the federal government to step in that instance. Put in charge and largely help to shape these two is a man by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson.
LBJ.
Yeah, LBJ.
The
Okay.
Junior.
Hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? We'll talk about that later. That's out of the Vietnam era. It's a protest chant during LBJ's administration. Okay, but that creation of the Commission on the Civil Rights, though, then will largely allow them to enforce some of these, okay, and to push for these. Now, it almost comes to a point in Little Rock where Eisenhower almost issues an executive order to block the work of Falbus, or what Falbus was doing. But he doesn't have to go there because of the creation of that Civil Rights Commission. Okay? In 1960, then, we see the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which basically made it so that you could not have any voter discrimination. And if we found in a particular area, based on the Civil Rights Commission, that they were preventing individuals from voting by using grandfather clauses or literacy tests or any of those things, then or poll taxes, we could go in as a federal commission and we could run the elections. Largely, the legislation that existed here is still largely in place in some of those southern states. Although in a very recent, like within the last year, there's been some change with that because of states starting to want voter ID and a specific piece of photo identification in order to ensure that the people that are voting are actually legal voters. Where the federal government stance on it is right now is by requiring that, is it a violation, and this is where they haven't decided this yet, but they will have to decide it, is it a violation of a person's ability to vote because not everyone has access to be able to have a photo ID issued? I don't know yet. Supreme Court hasn't decided on it. Okay? Now, the other way that they could get around it is they could have the federal referees come in and go to communities to get people photo identification. And rather than the people having to go get that photo ID, the government going to the people to do that. Does that make sense? So they're not having to miss work or stand in long lines or whatever else.
And the DMV in certain states is only open on 2 days of the week.
Or it's open from 8 to 4.
Yeah.
I mean, even for myself to get to the DMV to renew my driver's license is like
A hassle.
a hassle. Last year I went for a while without it being valid because I had to have it renewed on the 16th of May, which is my birthday, but I had a baby on the 12th of May.
Oh.
So,
Yeah, you're good.
you know, you know, it didn't happen. But anyways, okay? And I'm saying that as somebody who I own a vehicle, right? I am a driver, like, I'm gainfully employed, I'm working a job where if I needed to take a day off, I could take a day off. But there are plenty of other people out there that could not do that, okay? And so that's where the question becomes today, in a modern sense, of whether or not by requiring that voter ID, does it violate the 15th Amendment or the Voting Rights Act. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So that's where that question comes from, is from this legislation. So that is
A
synthesis. There you go. Yay. See, we're better at synthesis than we realize. Okay.
Maybe it just gets easier to synthesize the closer we get to it.
I think that's part of it too. You can make better connections to things. I think it also makes it easier to connect back to stuff once you know more of what's coming up. Does that make sense? So like if we were to talk about something from the 1920s, it's easier to connect that to the 1950s now because you've had both time frames.
That's true. That's true.
Whereas when we're sitting in the 1920s, it's hard to know
Yeah.
what I could connect it to. So, okay. All right. So the civil rights movement then largely will gain momentum following the following the integration of Little Rock, Arkansas, and we will see then that that movement grows pretty dramatically. Now that nonviolent passive resistance has many forms. As early as 1943, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, and other groups will push for sit-ins and to use the tactic of sit-ins. Boycotts, freedom rides will also be largely used and encouraged by Dr. King. Okay?
What's a freedom ride?
Okay. So a freedom ride, buses, interstate buses, outside of Montgomery, because Montgomery bus boycott, right? Okay. But if I got on a bus in New York to travel down to Mississippi, I would not be able to go from New York to Mississippi on that bus if I was an African American.
Yeah.
Because I'm an African American on a whites only bus, right? So a freedom ride was specifically designed to challenge the segregation on interstate bus systems.
Yeah.
Where the bus boycott, like the Montgomery, was intra-state, within the state. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that interstate should have been done with Brown v. Board. But much like Little Rock, Arkansas, the high school integration in that school isn't done with Brown v. Board.
Yeah.
Neither is the desegregation of the interstate buses done with Brown v. Board. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but that's basically what the Freedom Ride was. It was to challenge the segregation on interstate bus systems as well as the bus depots, because they were segregated also.
Yeah.
Where you could buy your ticket, where you could go to the bathroom, everything else like that. Okay? But the same, if Plessy v. Ferguson applies to trains, and the federal government can regulate that because you are going between the states on the trains, then you should be able to do the same thing on a bus, right? The federal government should be able to regulate that on a bus, okay?
Yeah.
So these tactics, the first actually begins in 1943, the sit-in, in the Jack Sprat Coffee House in Chicago, okay? And a sit-in, much as it sounds, you would literally go to a place and you would sit in, okay? In protest of the fact that you weren't allowed to be there because of the color of your skin. And on some of these occasions, they were arrested. In some instances, they were basically forcibly thrown out of the restaurant or wherever it was that they were at, coffee house, etc. Okay? But it brings a lot of strong reactions, both from those that want desegregation and those who oppose it. And so oftentimes it would erupt in violence. Now, probably one of the most well-known that is organized by CORE is the Greensboro sit-in in 1960. Okay? Now, the CORE is largely inspired by Thoreau and his work on civil disobedience. Okay? And so they use that kind of as their methodology for how they would passively resist and fight against it. Okay? In 1960. Now, here's what you need to know. It's 1960. So it's a what?
Election.
It's an election year, right? So even though Eisenhower has to a certain extent dealt with segregation and desegregation as a result, he hasn't finalized anything. And there is still racial turmoil and problems with segregation in the United States in 1960. But in 1960, he is now the lame duck president. He is on his way out, which means the new president coming in is going to have to deal with that. And that is going to come down between Nixon and Kennedy. In the first televised debates, which we'll talk more about, but in those first televised debates, it allows Kennedy to secure a victory because Kennedy wore makeup.
Really?
And Nixon refused. Kennedy understood what TV did to a person. And he understood that if he didn't wear makeup in the black and white and the technology of the day, that it would make him appear very washed out, very sickly, that he wouldn't look very good on camera, that he wouldn't come across on camera very well. Nixon, it's makeup.
Yeah.
I'm not wearing makeup.
Yeah.
Manly. Ugh, right? Not going to wear makeup. Well, Nixon appeared sickly. Those people that watched the debates on television believed that Kennedy won the debates and felt Kennedy was the better candidate. Those people that listened to the debates through the radio believed that Nixon won, which shows you now how important the television and media as a whole winds up becoming in our election system. Because had it not been for the TV, Nixon could have been president in 1960, and arguably probably would have been the president in 1960, because Kennedy, above all, and he was young, for one, and two, he was Catholic. Yes, is right, okay? You have to remember, and think about the foundations of who we were. There's a strong distrust for the Catholic Church, because of the fear that the Pope would have more power than the President of the United States. And therefore the Church would wind up in greater control. Much as you see that happens throughout European history, where the Catholic Church will basically control a country. So Americans still believe that. There is a reason why we've had one other dude run for president before as a Catholic, and he lost because he was Catholic. And Kennedy had to basically sign an oath of loyalty to the United States of America, not to the Catholic Church, because people were so fearful of the influence of the Catholic Church. So Kennedy winds up as the one who really has to deal with the whole civil rights issue to finalize things. Unfortunately, Kennedy is shot before he can finalize anything either, so it now winds up on the platter of Lyndon Baines Johnson. But Kennedy was in the works of getting more civil rights legislation passed. He just dies before it can actually go through. Okay? Now, the members of the Greensboro sit-in and others, including Martin Luther King Jr., were looked down upon pretty heavily by some key people in politics and in our system. J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist and had a gigantic file on him trying to prove that he was a communist. Okay? So he could get rid of him in political structure. Okay? All right, I just don't want to go on too much farther ahead of my other class. All right, so I'm just kind of giving you some other tidbits of information in there. Okay? J. Edgar Hoover, he's a little nuts, but he's a pretty cool dude once you kind of research him. Like, I mean, he's a little nuts, but he's I don't know. Best way I can say is he understood that knowledge was power. And so by creating as many files as he could with as much information about politicians, it allowed him to stay in charge and in power much longer than he should have been.